Applying a powerful combination of perfectionism and ruthlessness, Horton enabled the reserves to become the mainstay of the convoy escorts. At the height of the battle, when attacks on Allied shipping reached a peak, Admiral Horton would become Commander-in-Chief of the Western Approaches, with responsibility for ensuring the safe arrival of every single convoy that crossed the Atlantic Ocean. With characteristic determination, Horton would actually take up residence in the Western Approaches headquarters at Derby House in Liverpool. Here, he created a tactical school that utilized pleasure yachts and training submarines, gaining valuable practical experience for escort commanders. Forceful and determined, Horton was not popular with his superiors, but as one of the most able naval officers of the war, he was universally held in the highest regard. On the outbreak of war, Germany had possessed 2 modern battleships, 3 smaller pocket battleships, 1 uncompleted carrier, 9 cruisers, and almost 60 U-boats. She also had several aging battleships, 20 destroyers, and a small number of mine layers. Since then, the invasion of Norway had severely weakened the Kriegsmarine. A third of its cruiser force and half its destroyers had been sent to the bottom. These losses, and that of the Graf Spee, would be extremely difficult to replace. There were serious shortages of dockyard personnel, and every ton of steel for shipbuilding had to be won in the face of intense competition from the Air Force and Army. Although 2 more powerful battleships were soon to be commissioned, the loss of so many surface ships had made it clear to Hitler that their value was now overrated. The great successes of the U-boats, combined with the fact that they were much cheaper to build, had convinced him that Germany should put most of its naval construction effort into manufacturing submarines. In the summer of 1940, the Kriegsmarine had 51 U-boats, and with an ever-increasing number being launched, the U-boat arm looked set to achieve its aim of 300 operational submarines. The most numerous of all U-boats was the Type 7. Small and cheap to build, it had originally been designed for operations in the Mediterranean. The Type 7 was highly adaptable, and a great many versions would see service. It was fast on the surface, and twin rudders made it highly maneuverable. These qualities, and the ability to remain submerged for 18 hours, made the Type 7 ideal for night surface attacks. The Type 7 was cramped and uncomfortable to live in. But it was the workhorse of the U-boat arm, and nearly 700 would be built, more than half the total number of German submarines. The Type 7's successor was the Type 9, the early models of which were adapted and slightly enlarged 7s. However, the next versions were nearly 40 feet longer. The Type 9s had just 2 slow-running diesel engines instead of 6, which gave the boat an improved surface range at 12 knots of nearly 24,000 miles. 370 would be built during the course of the war, and the Type 9 would have the highest ratio of kills per submarine of all German U-boats. By the end of the war, Germany would launch in all nearly 1,200 U-boats of all types, and they were by far the Reich's most important maritime weapon. U-boats would eventually account for 70% of all Allied shipping losses to the Germans. The Scharnhorst, a 30,000-ton battlecruiser, had been laid down secretly in 1935, contravening the weight restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. Unlike traditional battlecruisers, which sacrificed armoured protection for heavy armament, the Scharnhorst reversed the principle. With its lighter, 11-inch guns, armour protection could be considerably increased. Additionally, the Scharnhorst was provided with an unprecedented number of heavy anti-aircraft guns. The Scharnhorst, paired with her sister ship, the Gneisenau, sorted into the Atlantic in early 1941, where their 10,000-mile cruising radius would make them deadly as commerce raiders. Even more importantly, the attempts by the Allies to destroy them would tie up vast quantities of Allied ships, fuel, and manpower. The Focke-Wulf 200 had originally been designed before the war as a long-distance airliner. It was successfully exported and made several record endurance flights. The 200 had once crossed the Atlantic Ocean non-stop in less than 24 hours. It was the Japanese armed forces who had first recognized the aircraft's reconnaissance potential, and in 1940, the Germans introduced their own military version, the Condor. Throughout the battle, Condors would prove highly effective, both as spotters for U-boats and as bombers. For much of the war, it was Germany's only four-engined bomber. Even with a huge 4,000-pound payload, the Condor could remain airborne for 14 hours, enabling it to menace Britain's shipping lanes far into the Atlantic. The Condor was dangerously prone to structural failures, and many aircraft were lost in landing accidents. It was lightly armoured, and with just 3 machine guns, was highly vulnerable to other aircraft. Nevertheless, nearly 300 Condors were built, and they earned a formidable reputation among Allied sailors. The secret raiders were German merchant ships, disguised as neutral or Allied traders, and armed with old First World War guns. Dispatched into the Atlantic, the vessels operated alone, preying on unsuspecting Allied shipping. During the course of the war, 11 merchants would be converted into raiders, and many would patrol the sea lanes of the Atlantic. Their greatest success, like the battlecruiser commerce raiders, was in diverting Allied resources away from convoy protection. Of all the secret marauders, the most destructive was Atlantis, known to British intelligence as Raider C. Manned with some of the very best crews the Kriegsmarine could muster, the Atlantis would be responsible for sinking 22 Allied merchant vessels, in voyages eventually totaling more than 100,000 miles. Before going into combat in the Atlantic Ocean, every U-boat officer, engineer and rating had to have passed through an elite training school, secretly established in 1933.